Olaso. So a brief comment about causality, and then we'll return to meditation. This time going back to shamatha. And that is, it was stated here in the Sautrantika view that all real phenomena have causal efficacy. They're all causes, they're all effects. And this includes the causality not only between mental events and physical, that obviously intention, for example, intention influences matter. Skyscrapers, buildings, where did they come from? Well, people had an intention, they had an idea, they had architectural designs, and so what could be more obvious than mental events influence physical? And of course, physical influences mental, that's perfectly obvious. But there's also the other category, that great big open bag of real phenomena that do have causal efficacy, but which are neither modes of apprehending, they're not mental states, and nor are they physical, and they too have causal efficacy. So again, let's take an obvious one, qualia, appearances, colors. The colors that we see, the qualia that we see, they're not physical, they're not a mental state, but the colors we see, of course, they have causal efficacy. Semantic information. You're my person. Victoria, would you please raise your right hand? Thank you, that's enough. Thank you very much. That was semantic information. I made a request, I was polite, she was very polite, she did it. So semantic information, that has causal efficacy. Had I not said that, had you not understood, your hand wouldn't go up. So semantic information is not physical, it's not a mental state, has causal efficacy. Time has causal efficacy. We know that in modern physics, space-time influences matter. It influences the course of matter as matter bends space-time. It warps space-time. And so, but then we ask, well, what about mechanisms? That is, how can the mind influence matter? The mind is non-physical, the ghost in the machine, the common metaphor. How can that happen? How can that happen? And the whole approach in Buddhism, just all the way through, is the approach to causality. This goes right back to the Pali Canon and the 12 links of dependent origination. That's all causality. The nature as causality is understood in the Buddhist tradition all the way through has never been mechanistic. Never. It just didn't come up at all. Probably because the most important causality is causality about suffering, what causes the suffering, and suffering is not mechanical, and the causes of suffering are not mechanical, and the interface between the two is not mechanical. So you're starting out where mechanism just doesn't make any sense at all. All kinds of things can make unhappy. Somebody can frown at us, and that can make us unhappy. Where's the mechanism? Obviously, there's none. And so causality, and this I find very interesting myself, causality in Buddhism is purely phenomenological. You don't need a mechanism because often there isn't, and occasionally there are. 2 billiard balls bump into each other, and then okay, that was a mechanical causal interaction. But A causes B, and this we again learned in the opening months of that formal monastic training, which Tibetan monks have been receiving since the time of Tsongkhapa, 15th century at least, earlier even, is that A causes B if, had A not occurred, B could not have occurred. So you know something is causal only retrospective. The mere fact that A precedes B, like the sun came up this morning, and I'm scratching my head now. One came first, but did the sun coming up cause me to scratch my head? No, it preceded it. But it didn't cause it. So the mere fact that one thing precedes another obviously doesn't mean it causes it or even influences it in any way. But had A not occurred, then B would not have, could not have, wouldn't have. So it's retrospective. Had there been no kernel of corn, no sprout of corn. But this means, how do you know wouldn't have? And that is, we have these tokens. People have lucky charms. And American baseball players, notoriously, they'll do something. Or they got a rabbit's foot, or they've got something that makes them hit better, placebo effect. But lucky charms, all these kind of things, and don't walk under a ladder and you see a black cat, all the superstitions we have. Somebody saw a black cat once and something really bad happened. Therefore, if you see a black cat, look out. So they're just saying one happened and then thinking, oh, that's generalizable. Well, that's sheer superstition. But then how does it go from superstition, A preceded B, but A didn't cause B, to A preceded B and it did cause B, either as a substantial cause, it actually transformed into it, or it contributed to it. Sometimes if a specific contributing factor is not there, like water, then you got the seed and you got the soil and you have the sunshine, and you're not going to get a sprout of corn. Just one contributing factor was necessary, and that wasn't there. No water, no corn. And so it becomes interesting then. The mere fact of precedence does not in any way imply causality, and yet causes do precede effects. This is good, solid, like Newtonian mechanics. It just makes sense. Nothing spooky or weird about it. A cause has to precede its effect. They never occur simultaneously, and it's just good, chunky, real time. Time is real, time is absolute in Sautrantika system. And so how do you know is you have to keep your eyes open repeatedly. Now, where this really has a close bearing is suffering. Because that's what we care most about, isn't it? We always care about suffering. We can give up on all kinds of other things, marriage, kids, job, and so forth. We can give up on happiness, but we just never give up on suffering because we never want it. And if we can ever get some relief, we want that. We can't stop that. So what causes it? And then we can see, well, as I mentioned before, what couldn't trigger suffering? The sun coming up, air, space. I've asked many times and nobody's been able to point to anything in the world around us. I've always been able to shoot it down. People have given it a good try. They've never been able to point to something that I've not been able to blow away. Say, no, that could happen. Having kids, having no kids, either one can cause suffering. And just the list goes on. In other words, pretty much anything in the world could possibly be a cooperative condition for suffering. But they may not be. What's a substantial cause? And what's the primary cause? A primary cause is yudan-gen, primary cause and contributing condition. It's cooperative condition, contributing condition. A primary cause is, if that weren't there, it would never happen. And so here's a Buddhist analysis. If you had no delusion, if you didn't misapprehend reality at all, and you had no derivative mental afflictions of craving, attachment, or hostility, anger, if you had none, mind's completely free, nothing could arouse them. Nothing whatsoever, no contributing causes could possibly arouse them. They say you've burnt the seed, you've cut the root. You're incapable of feeling delusion and then the derivative mental afflictions. You're an arhat. If you're an arhat, then nothing whatsoever can give you mental distress. They can harm your body, they can kill your body, that's easy. But even when Moggallanaputra was beaten to death, he was one of the two principal disciples of the Buddha. It said he was beaten to death, his mind was completely calm. You know? So then we find, wow, this is a big deal. It's not other people, it's not politics, it's not your physical health. It's none of the above that are the primary causes without which suffering cannot arise. So, but a final point here, and I will wrap up, go to meditation, it will be interesting, and relating to this, is that it's entirely phenomenological. Had this not occurred, this wouldn't have occurred. Because this occurred, this triggered that, and this triggered that, this triggered that. So I said, please raise your right hand. That was just some noise coming out of my mouth, but it wasn't inarticulate sound, it wasn't just noise. I was speaking in a language we both understand. I knew what I was saying, you know what I request. You saw no reason to say no, so the hand came up. Where's the mechanism between the semantic information coming out and her understanding? Where's the mechanism? And there isn't any. And there never has been. And only for a tiny category of reality are there actually mechanisms. You can see things bumping into each other. But it was just a few years ago, I was at a conference in Hamburg, and there was a very, very good neuroscientist. I've read some of her papers, they're very, very good. And she got to the podium, and I remember what she said. She said, I'm a neuroscientist, therefore I believe the mind is the brain. Nice and clear. I love people to be clear. Said, I'm a neuroscientist, therefore I'm a brain. And I was thinking this morning, just before coming here, it was like saying, I'm a Marxist, therefore I believe in Das Kapital. Is that correct? Das Kapital? Stimmt, ja. So, but if you don't believe in Das Kapital, if you don't believe any stuff that Marx wrote, then why call yourself a Marxist, right? And so I'm a Marxist because I believe in Marxist theories. That's not true, but that would be the case. And so she said, I'm a neuroscientist, therefore I believe the mind is the brain. And so then I asked her, I just don't stop, you know. I asked her, the brain and the mind are so, they don't even have any common characteristics. The brain has mass, location, it's squishy, it's blah, 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 and mind, none of the above. So why are you taking two things that don't even have any common characteristics, and why are you equating them? It's like saying tomato and giraffe. I mean, they're more common. They have more in common, a tomato and a giraffe, than the brain and the mind do. At least the tomato is physical, the giraffe's physical. Maybe a tomato could morph into a giraffe. I doubt it, but I guess I can imagine it. So I said, why are you equating them when they don't even have a single characteristic in common? And her answer I thought was very interesting. She said, I have to believe the mind is physical. And what other physical thing would it be than the brain? I have to believe that the mind is physical, otherwise I can't imagine how it could influence the brain or the brain could influence it. I can't imagine how that could be the case. And so a very, very intelligent woman, very good scientist, and when it comes to physics, she's living in the 19th century. Because that's the last time that physicists could say that with a straight face. It was Kelvin. There's got to be luminiferous ether. The only way that things can interact with each other in the physical world, they have to bump into each other. And then relativity theory and quantum mechanics have made that just a dead idea. There's nobody that believes that. What's the mechanism of space-time influencing the trajectory of planets? What's the mechanism? And can you imagine it? First of all, imagine curved space-time. Go ahead, give it a shot. And now imagine a planet's coming along and it starts going in a circle instead of a straight line. Go ahead, imagine, how's that doing? Oh, by the way, the planet itself is warping the space-time around it. So tell me, imagine that. How does a chunk of matter warp the space-time around it? Forget about it. Not even the most brilliant physicists can imagine that. And then quantum mechanics. Take a big high-energy photon and then shoot two lower-energy photons off in different directions from the mother photon. Shoot them off in two different directions. And let them go for a while, 186,000 miles in different trajectories. And then when you get around to it, then measure one of those photons. And when you do it, its wave function will collapse. In that same instant, this is action at a distance, entanglement. In that exactly the same instant, perfect simultaneity, in that moment that you collapse the wave function for one photon, and the other one that's entangled with it, its wave function will collapse as well. It's very well demonstrated. It's just a fact. What's the mechanism? Simultaneously, two photons could be light years apart. Influence one, the other one's influence in the same instant. So again, the notion of mechanism works really well if you're still going to your lab on a horse and buggy. But it's gone. It's finally gone. So how do thoughts influence the brain? If you had not thought that, the brain wouldn't have done that. That's it. And the brain, how does a lot of alcohol contact in the brain, how does that how does that cause you to tell silly jokes? And start drinking, singing in a really off key? How does you go from alcohol in your brain to singing off key? Where's the mechanism? There isn't one. But had you not drunk, you wouldn't be telling stupid jokes and singing off key. And that can be demonstrated. Right? Just do it again and run it again and again. He drinks, he sings. He doesn't drink, he doesn't sing. He drinks, he sings. Doesn't drink. Got it. But only once wouldn't do it. Because sometimes people tell these silly jokes and drink and sing in a silly way without drinking alcohol. Okay? So this is Buddhist phenomenology. Happily, it never fell into the trap of materialism, so it didn't need to extricate itself from it. From the very beginning, it's purely phenomenological, and that's exactly what physics says now. What's the mechanism between two photons going like that? There is no mechanism. It happens. Get over it. Had he not tweaked the first one, the second one would not have been tweaked. You can do that again and again, and you'll find it's true every single time. That's causality. But you have to do it repeatedly. Do it once, maybe it's coincidence. But if you do it repeatedly, it's not coincidence. This caused that. But as a contributing factor, because the first photon didn't turn into the second photon, so I'm looking at this 1,500-year-old theory of causality and thinking, this still works? And it has more explanatory power over the origins of the human mind and what happens at death than anything that the materialists come up with, because they've come up with nothing. Not that they don't know anything about the mind, but they don't know anything about the nature of the mind or the origins of the mind or the nature of consciousness. They have 150 years to try, flat. So here's one, they've been working on this for 2,500 years. And all kinds of discoveries. So there it is. It comes back to the familiar theme of all branches of natural science, starting with Galileo. If you want to understand something, look at it carefully, with all the sophistication you can. And that's astronomy, and it's biology, physics, chemistry, all of it. Look at it carefully with as much sophistication and rigor as you can. Make replicable observations and replicable experiments. You get consensual knowledge. And the difference between science and philosophy, science which used to be called natural philosophy, is what was called also experimental philosophy. Come up with a bright idea and then subject it to experimental or experiential confirmation or repudiation. Science has progressed over the last 400 years. It would be difficult to give a similar argument for philosophy. It's very bright, a lot of cool ideas, but consensual knowledge doesn't have. And neither does theology have consensual knowledge. Everybody disagrees, unless you're of the same denomination. So we go back to meditation now, and we'll go back to shamatha. We'll go back to honing our skills, refining our skills of observing the mind and making sure we don't leave anything out. So let's jump in. We'll have one more session. I'll give a bit more guided meditation. We come back to equilibrium, a balance, a freedom from bias, distortion, agitation. An inner stillness, a calm, a sense of ease and clarity. Settling body, speech, and mind in the natural states. And as we venture into the main practice for this session, shamatha focused on the mind, or settling the mind in its natural state, let your eyes again be at least partially open, your gaze soft and unfocused, resting in the space in front of you. It is very helpful to have this sense of spaciousness, no claustrophobic sense of being inside your head. Banish any notion that thoughts, mental events are inside your head. Also, having the eyes open may help. You may find it helpful for grounding your awareness in the present moment, so you don't drift off. With your gaze vacant, single-pointedly focus your mental awareness. From the stillness of awareness, direct the light of your awareness to the sixth domain, the space of the mind. And whatever mental events arise there, be they objective appearances like mental images or subjective impulses like desires, focus single-pointedly on that domain without being distracted elsewhere, without being carried away by thoughts, and without identifying with any of the activities of the mind, so that your awareness merges with them and you get lost in them. Again, maintain this lucidity with respect to the space of your mind and whatever happens in it. We've learned how to crystallize the flow of attention with respect to objective appearances arising in this domain by deliberately generating a thought or an image, letting it vanish and keeping attention focused right where it was, because they disappear right into the domain from which the next thought or image will emerge. But it's ever so important not to overlook the direct perception of subjective mental events that arise, a wide variety of them. Not to focus solely on appearances, but from the stillness of awareness observe the movements, the arising and passing of desires, emotions, feelings, mental afflictions, virtuous mental processes. To observe them without identifying with them, fusing with them. And the hypothesis I'm presenting to you is we become aware of these subjective impulses only retrospectively, but maybe just a quarter of a second, a half second after they've arisen. It's good enough. Be aware of them without merging with them or being carried away by them. But because these subjective impulses come through the back door, so to speak, they don't present themselves to you, but arise unbeknownst to you in that first instant, they are difficult to identify. So let's see if we can crystallize the attention to prime us for being able to observe as swiftly as possible these subjective impulses, such as feelings. Let's imagine that right now, in terms of feeling, three kinds of feeling. They're very simple: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. That's the Buddhist understanding of feeling, Vedana in Sanskrit. Just pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Let's imagine, generally, that right now we're resting or experiencing neutral feeling. The subjective tone of your awareness is neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Maybe that's not true, but I'll suggest maybe it is. From this neutrality then, as we yesterday generated a thought and then an image, let's do something pleasant, why not? I invite you now to think of something. Recall some memory, or it could be a fantasy. It could be an image. But recall something, bring something to mind. That arouses a sense of pleasure. Brings a sense of joy. I'll just give one example, but then you find your own. Imagine the sound of children playing in a playground and laughing. Just happy, enjoying playing with each other. All safe, parents looking on. And they're just so tickled. They're giggling, they're laughing, really enjoying themselves. That's just one example. Find your own, or that one if you like. Bring whatever it is to mind that is bound to arouse some gladness, some pleasure. So do this very deliberately, going from neutral to a positive, pleasant feeling. And as that pleasant feeling arises, observe it. Sooner or later, it's going to dim, fade away. Back into the space of awareness. Keep your attention right there. You've found the right domain. And see if you can observe the next feeling that arises. Or some emotion. Or maybe it's a desire. Whatever comes up, just observe it. Let it play itself out. And sooner or later, it will dissolve. So run with this exercise a few times, if you will. You could arouse another emotion, irritation or unhappiness, but if you like pleasant, go with pleasant. But generate it, see it come up, observe it, watch what happens. And when it's disappeared, stay right there in the immediacy of the present moment, single-pointedly focused on the space of the mind, and observe the next thing that comes up, objective or subjective. Observe the movements from the perspective of the stillness of your awareness. This is not a separate meditation from the one we did yesterday. But we're explicitly drawing this out this time just to make sure that when you do focus on the space of the mind, whenever arises, that you don't skip anything, you don't overlook the subjective impulses because you're attending only to the objective appearances. Whatever arises from moment to moment, observe its nature, let it be. as you can deliberately generate an emotion, a feeling. If you wish, you could also deliberately generate a desire. Normally these just happen to us. A desire just comes up, a feeling, an emotion just comes up. But see how you can, if you wish, premeditatively, deliberately, generate a desire, a mental affliction, a feeling. Crystallize your attention on that, observe it, arise, play itself out, and vanish. If you would like to move from shamatha, which is a mere observing, a bare attention, focused, selective, if you'd like to move beyond that into the realm of vipassana, insight meditation, then as you're observing the arising and passing of appearances within the space of the mind and subjective mental impulses, examine closely. How do they influence each other? Can one image influence or cause a later image? One thought trigger a later thought? One desire trigger an emotion trigger a feeling triggering a desire? Observe the causality in this immaterial, non-physical domain. It's not chaos. It's interdependence. Desires, intentions, emotions, all of these are mental impulses. They are real, they have causal efficacy. They in turn arise independent upon prior causes and conditions. Within this matrix of causality, within the domain of the mind, do you see any evidence that you are a cause of anything that happens in the mind? Bearing in mind that intention also is not a person, it's a mental impulse, just like desire, feelings. you account for the events, the effects taking place within this domain. Purely in terms of causality within the domain, but of course the senses can also influence mental events. You hear a sound and it gives rise to a feeling or a desire, or a mental image. You feel a tactile sensation, it gives rise to a desire. I want to move. And then you move, or you don't. So in this matrix of causality, physical influencing mental, mental, physical, mental influencing mental. Are you a player, apart from the mental and physical? Do you see evidence that you're influencing? Examine closely. One final observation, again in the mode of vipassana. When you observe an objective appearance, like observing a thought coming up or an image, does your sheer observation of that appearance have any influence on it? Does it make it disappear? Does it perpetuate it? Does it alter it? What influence does observation have on what you're observing? And when a subjective impulse, like a feeling arises, sadness, gladness, anxiety, what happens to that subjective feeling or emotion when you observe it? Any effect? Observe closely what happens when you observe a subjective mental state. And for the last minute or so, just relax. Rest in the stillness of your awareness. And just observe what arises and passes within the space of the mind. Stillness, observing motion. So I think I better move on through the notes and just your pagination is a bit different from mine, but for the next point, right after Buddha's discourse to Bahiya, there's a quote from a Singaporean Theravada monk. You can read it. I'll leave it. I won't spend time on that. Time is short. But the next point really is quite interesting. And this is just classic Buddhism. It's all schools. It's in the Pali Canon, it's Mahayana, Vajrayana. It's everywhere. Understanding causality with respect to the world around us. Where does it come from? And so the classic Buddhist worldview, true or false, this is the way it is, that this world that we're experiencing, that the world that scientists experience, whether it's astrophysicists or molecular biologists, with this world, that's a physical world, but also the animate sentient beings within it. This world is called the desire realm. That pertains to not just human beings, but sentient beings within the so-called desire realm. It's called desire because in our relentless pursuit of freedom from suffering and trying to find pleasure and happiness, we move. We move from here to there because we find we'll get something if we go over there that we won't get if we stay here. And we keep on moving, and we keep on moving until we don't. And then the body stops, and consciousness moves off into the bardo looking for some better grazing grounds. And so that's why it's called desire realm. Because we sentient beings, keep on thinking our happiness is some out there someplace. And let's go find that place, the happy place, the place free of suffering. So it's a desire realm. Well, we call it the universe, the physical universe with its sentient inhabitants. And the Buddhist worldview is actually no smaller than modern 2019 cosmology, which gives us 100 billion galaxies. 100 years ago, they only knew there was one, Milky Way. 1919, one Milky Way, only one. In the 20s, then Hubble discovered 2 or 3, the Andromeda. That's cool. There's more than one. Cool. 100 years later, we have 100 billion galaxies. Each one has anywhere between 100 billion and 1 trillion stars. And those studying exoplanets now are generally speculating on the average probably about 1 planet per star. So 100 billion times 100 billion. So and although scientists don't know for sure whether any of those other planets are inhabited, I think that the bet is on how could they not be? 100 billion times 100 billion? Only one? Not likely. And the Buddhist view is actually similar. It's not based on telescopes and mathematics, but there's a phrase that comes up of Dongsum Gijikten, which is sometimes mistranslated as trillicism, like 3,000-fold world. It's not 3,000. It's 1,000 to the third power. That's what it means. And so it's billion. 1,000 times 1,000 times 1,000 is, at least in American enumeration, it's called a billion. 1,000 million. And so in the Buddhist cosmology, it said this desire realm that is the world system. That's what it's called, a world system. And a world system is basically an inhabited planet. A meteor is not a world system because nobody's on it. A sun is not a world system, presumably it's uninhabited, at least by being creatures like us. But if you have a planet and it's inhabited by any sentient being at all, human or otherwise, then that's called a loka, a world system. And it's said that world systems come in clusters of 1 billion. And there are countless billion-fold world systems. That's what it says in Buddhism, countless, billion-fold. So just to play around a little bit, briefly, I find it interesting, it's hard to be short, but our galaxy has something like, what was the last count, 200 billion stars, something like that, maybe 100 billion. And so 100 billion stars in our Milky Way, and if, that's just sheer speculation what I'm about to do, but if 1 out of 100, 1% of the stars, 1%, 1 out of 100, of the stars in our galaxy is inhabited by some kind of sentient being, perhaps unimaginable, but some sentient being that actually experiences, then our galaxy would be a billion-fold world system. Because it has 100 billion stars, and 1 out of 100 has a planet, one planet that's inhabited. A galaxy would be a billion-fold world system. And then a lot of just dead planets and stars with nothing on it. And so And then it said there are countless of those. So that's a desire realm. But then we can ask, okay, well, this physical universe with sentient inhabitants, so we'll be inclusive, space, time, matter, energy, and conscious beings dwelling in this desire realm, this physical universe that we know of. And the Buddhist is just as big as modern, which is incredibly vast in space and in time. And time also in the Buddhist view is no less. 13.8 billion since this particular cosmos came up. Buddhists work on similar time scales of also expansion and contraction. That's also Buddhist worldview, been around since the Buddha. But where did it all come from? Is it steady state? Has it always been here, just constant, like Aristotle thought? The answer is no. No. World systems, and I'll use this word loka, I'm not trying to do something new agey here. Stick with traditional account terminology. A world system, and then these billion-fold world systems, and then multiple countless world systems occurring simultaneously. These emerge from, they have a birth and they have a death, and they emerge from a subtler dimension of existence, which is called the form realm, or rupa dhatu. And it's physical, but it's not material. There's no atoms there, but it's physical as in forms are physical. But it's much subtler than this. So a desire realm is like a holographic image or display, an effulgence of a subtler dimension, which is form realm, pure form, form realm. And there are beings who dwell in the form realm. They're devas in the form realm. And desire realms come and then they collapse back into, over billions of years, a desire realm will come up and then it will collapse back into, and then it's gone. And all the sentient beings in that desire realm will have to transmigrate elsewhere to another, because these are out of sequence. So when one is collapsing, another one's arising, and they all migrate over. No sentient being just becomes non-existent, and no fresh sentient beings get created. They're all just conservation principle. And then form realm also, you say, where did that come from? Formless realm. Form realms emerge from and dissolve back into formless realm. So that's the view, true or false, that's it. And that's what the Buddha said he saw. And that's the Buddhist worldview. Where this gets very interesting, I will read, it's a lot, but, no, you read it. Padavahera Vajiranyana. It's an outstanding book, and you can download it for free on the internet. It's legal, you're not robbing. Buddhist Meditation and Theory and Practice, you can read it. I paraphrase very carefully what he said there, but I find it really quite fascinating. And point 8 here is the sensory phenomena of the desire realm in this Buddhist view. You can see it from right there in Vajiranyana. He's an outstanding Theravada Buddhist scholar. The sensory phenomena of the desire realm are like holographic appearances, derivative of the true elements of the form realm. That is, in the form realm, there are these archetypal forms of earth, water, fire. Thank you. Sorry for torturing you. In this world here, we have the periodic table of elements of Mendeleev, which is brilliant. And the Buddhist is earth, water, fire, air, and space. Doesn't look so brilliant. But they're actually both brilliant in very different ways. The periodic table with its elements, with the gases, helium, hydrogen, and so forth, and then on to uranium-235 and so on, in the classic physicist and chemist view, that's what's out there when nobody's looking. Helium, suns, hydrogen, and so forth. You can look or not look, doesn't matter. That's what's really out there. And those are the fundamental constituents of the physical world, the elements, the periodic table. So it's brilliant. It's outstanding science. And it's trying to understand, as all of physics was until the 20th century, trying to understand what's out there when nobody's looking. And that's what they came up with. It's outstanding science. Buddhists have never been interested in that. What's out there when nobody's looking? Out there when nobody's looking, there's no suffering out there, because nobody's experiencing. So the interest has always been in the Lebenswelt, the world of experience. And in our world of experience, they found that 5 elements, and so did the Greeks, so did the Hindus and so forth, find that 5 elements is quite sufficient. Everything I experience in the physical world, it's maybe solid, earth element, maybe fluid, or a mixture of solid and fluid, mud, or viscous qualities. So there's fluid, there's moisture. There's a whole gradient of heat, that's a fire element. If it's strong, it's hot. If it's cool, if it's low, it's cold. That's immediate experience, that's perception. You can directly perceive solidity, moisture, gradient from heat to cold, and then motion of all kinds, that's the air element. and all of this taking place within the space element, it turns out the 5 was quite sufficient. It has none of the utility of the periodic table for technology and so forth. It's not even in the competition, but in terms of first-person experience, it's brilliant. It's quite sufficient. You can check for yourself. Have you ever detected any tactile sensation, your physical awareness of the physical world, that doesn't fit into one or more combination of solid, fluid, warmth, or motion, and then the space in which they occur? So, phenomenologically, it's a good system. And it's said that then all of these elements, earth, water, fire, and air, and so forth, in the desire realm, in this experienced desire realm, all of these emerge from archetypal forms in the form realm. And they're exactly that, archetypal realm. Just read Vajrayana. It's an outstanding book. And he shows these are the archetypal emblems or signs from which, when a desire realm emerges, then the archetypes display themselves as solid things and fluid and so forth and so on. And so hence the power of mastering the signs from Vajrayana. If you master the signs by achieving shamatha, achieving jhana, entering the form realm, and identifying and mastering the archetypes of earth, water, fire, and air, which can be done with samadhi, and Buddhaghosa describes exactly how. It's like a chemistry textbook. That's in the 5th century, and Vajrayana explains how in 20th century English. If you master these archetypal signs in the form realm, then you can actually manipulate earth, water, fire, air in this desire realm. And that's an outrageous claim. Pretty much all traditional Buddhists believe it. They say, hey, we've been doing it for 2,000 years. We weren't born yesterday. And so that's pretty interesting. Let's move on. We have a bit of time. Oh, not much. Okay, substrate consciousness. You know that, so I'm going to skip it. B. C. Dujum Lingpa. You know it. I'm going to skip it. You can read it. It's right there. It's pretty cool. If you have questions about it, I can answer, I think, pretty much anything that comes up. But let's just jump. We have a couple of minutes because this next stuff is so cool. So that's just straight Buddhism. That's classic Buddhism that I just gave you. And you find it in Sautrantika. It's part of the Sautrantika worldview. But then we go to parallels in ancient and modern physics. The originator of materialism in Western philosophy is the Greek philosopher Democritus, 5th century or so? Pretty close to 5th century before the Common Era. Anybody know better? 5th century, very close. 6th. So Democritus, he states, direct quote, he's having a conversation between the intellect and the senses, the reasoning mind and the perceiving mind. Intellect said, sweet is by convention. Sweet is not objectively real. Sweet is just what we say is sweet. So it's just relative, it's subjective. Sweet is by convention, and bitter by convention, hot by convention. These are all subjective impressions. Cold by convention, color by convention. That's what's subjective. That's the qualia. But what's really out there? In truth, there are but atoms and the void. Very famous statement. All that really exists out there is atoms and space. Richard Feynman, one of the brilliant physicists in the 20th century, because I read him quite extensively, he stated in his Feynman lecture series, all of human behavior can be explained in terms of the movements of atoms. That's Democritus, straight Democritus. But that's the intellect speaking. But then Democritus himself gives the senses a voice. And the senses say, this is our perceptions of colors and all of these kind of things. The senses retorts, wretched mind, you intellect, wretched mind, from us you are taking the evidence by which you would overthrow us. What is the evidence? You're taking the evidence by which you're taking convention, you're taking sweet and bitter and hot and so forth, you're taking this away from us to overthrow us and say, in reality, there's only space and atoms. But your victory is your own fall. And that is, as soon as you come back to your senses, how can you believe that the only things that exist is atoms and space when everything experiencing is neither atoms nor space? It's qualia all the way through. So how can you, with your intellect, deny what you're experiencing every single moment? The senses come back and slap intellect silly. Pythagoras, see if this resonates. I have to stop, but it's so cool. We just read Buddhism, right? Desire realm, formless realm. Pythagoras, contemporary of the Buddha, he is very renowned for knowing. He coined the term philosophy, by the way. Great mathematician, great pioneer of Western philosophy altogether. He said everything boils down to numbers. Very famous for that. And then he started a lineage called the Pythagoreans, people who followed in his footsteps, and they elaborated and said numbers are identified with geometrical forms. So in fact, there's a realm of pure number. From that realm emerges geometrical forms, and from that emerges what we regard as the physical universe. Number to form, algebra to geometry, to this. And Plato said the first principles of the monad and the indefinite dyad, that goes back to Pythagoras as well, from which, so this is really the fundamental, the ultimate, and from which arise the first numbers. Sounds a little bit like formless realm. Then plane and solid figures, form realm, ring a bell. And finally the bodies of the sensible world, the desire realm. Pythagoras had very, very deep samadhi. That was quite clear. And he probably learned it from people from the East, because the Greeks didn't have it, the Egyptians didn't have samadhi. He probably got it from somebody in the East. So that looks very similar to the three realms. We'll end on this point, and then we'll take a break. Physicist Werner Heisenberg, one of the greatest architects of modern quantum mechanics, really top-notch and brilliant, really brilliant. These philosophers, these physicists back then, Einstein, de Broglie, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, they all knew philosophy. They got a good classical European education. And so they knew their philosophy. Many of them studied Greek, unlike American education. So Heisenberg, having his European education, classic education, he, looking back on history, back to the time of Democritus and Pythagoras, he states, and I quote, "With regard to this question, modern physics takes a definite stand against the materialism of Democritus and for Plato and the Pythagoreans." So that's fun. There's more that even gets cooler, but that'll have to wait until after lunch. So it's now 12:35. Let's come back at 2:35. Enjoy your lunch, and now we have lots to practice. Lots and lots of practice. When you're eating, see what's real and what's not. So, see you at 2:35.